Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a classic review of the Tangerine Dream record, PHEDRA. Tangerine Dream was a German electronic music outfit founded in the 60s by Mr. Edgar Froese, who passed away recently, incredibly unfortunate, but up until that point, the band had remained pretty active with a steady stream of studio albums and live albums and soundtrack work. They even did the cinematic soundtrack to the new Grand Theft Auto video game. However, in this review here, we are going to be focusing on one of their more popular records, an album that came out in the midst of a very fruitful point in the group's career in the 70s while they were signed to Virgin Records. As discussed in my classic review of the Kraftwerk album Trans-Europe Express 1970s, very different time for electronic music. For the genre, it was early, but it was still very much alive. And at this time, the artists in Germany's blossoming electronic, experimental, psychedelic music scene were dropping their best stuff. People like Can and Neu, Kraftwerk, Faust, Harmonia, Cluster, and all of these groups had different styles, different directions, and Tangerine Dream was further down on the more electronic side of that spectrum. Though they were still influenced by things like progressive rock and psychedelic rock, as well as classical music and minimalism. And again, it's the 70s, a different time for electronic music before the explosion in relevancy of drum machines during the new wave synth pop zenith of the 80s. Though throughout their career, Tangerine Dream incorporated a multitude of different instruments into their records, guitars and basses, drums, woodwinds, and acoustic instrumentation, the band's approach to writing was mostly synthesizer or keyboard based. Moogs and organs, mellotrons, electric pianos, as well as sequencers. And with this instrumentation, the band would create these 10, 20, or almost 30-minute compositions that were epic and moody and amorphous. And it wasn't unusual for an artist like Tangerine Dream to put together 2 or 4 tracks of this size and just call it an album. And artists in this branch of Germany's experimental, pioneering music scene at the time, artists that were making these long, textured, atmospheric compositions, music historians would label them as being part of the Berlin School. Keep in mind, there isn't literally a school. This label also includes artists like Klaus Schulze, who also played with Tangerine Dream early on in the band's career, or Manuel Gottsching, who has solo work as well, who also created music with Ashra and Ashra's Temple. But if you wanted to cast a wider net for this genre of music, you could simply call it progressive electronic, and then it would include artists like France's Jean-Michel Jarre or Greece's Vangelis, who I actually think showcased just a little bit more classical music influence in his works. Music of this style at the time, it had an audience, it was popular in its own right, but it saw even more exposure through soundtrack work for television and film. People like Vangelis actually saw great success through this on soundtracks like Chariot of Fire or Blade Runner. And these television and film soundtracks would have a huge influential impact on more modern artists like Boards of Canada or Zombie. So that's much of the context that surrounds this record, but what does the music itself offer? Well, this record is essentially 4 tracks, not that long of an album, definitely easier to get into than some of the more dense works earlier on in the band's discography like Zeet. We have the almost 17-minute title track, the mysterious semblance at the Strand of Nightmares, not as long, movements of a visionary, and then the sort of tidbit 2-minute closer, Sequent C, which we can kind of get out of the way now. It leaves the album off with a very ethereal, airy, relaxed feel. It's essentially a flute piece with a lot of echo or reverb or delay on the flute to the point where the very slow moving notes are kind of just folding over one another very pleasantly, very beautifully. The centerpiece of this record really is the title track here. To kick things off, you get these pulsating synth sequences growing in size behind a wall of ethereal synth chords. Eventually, this gives way to some very stiff but elegant lead melodies that just shimmer. I would describe them as silvery or shiny, and there's something kind of futuristic about them too. And the track essentially transitions from one tension-building synth phrase to another, until we get to a point where we're getting like these demon calls popping up in every direction as they swim through this sea of synthesizer swells. But the synthesizer sequences, or the arpeggios that are just bubbling and just keeping rhythm throughout the song, suddenly start shifting in pitch around the second third of the track, which I read in a few places might have just been a technical issue with the equipment they were using starting to get overheated from either just being on a long time or just heavy use. So the band essentially uses this opportunity to just shift the song away from this part to another movement entirely. Tangerine Dream really coasts into a very desolate soundscape to end the song off, and there are these really weird wailing tones hanging in the distance that sound like like a baby polar bear calling out for its mother in the middle of a blizzard in a frozen tundra. Then these dreary chords are introduced, and the song essentially sounds like it's soundtracking its own apocalypse, really. The next track, Mysterious Semblance, is much more simple in build. The song essentially features these dreary, airy synth chords that really make up the bulk of the track. These synth chords are treated to various effects or just some studio trickery that changes the size or the shape or the distance or just how thin or full the chords feel. Sometimes they're panned hard to the left or the right. For a moment, the synth chords are swallowed by windy effects. I think the actual music that these chords are playing, that the synths are playing, is really beautiful and really touching. It's really somber, but the way Tangerine Dream treats this synth playing, it's like you're listening to what's going on as well as trying to keep your eyes or just your conscious on where exactly the instrumentation is moving throughout the recording. However, the recording toward the end becomes much larger and much more vast and sounds like the lonesome terrain of a distant planet somewhere. Moments like this are really ambient and very low key, not anywhere near as lively as some of the more rock influenced stuff Tangerine Dream would drop on albums like Force Majeure in the late 70s. And the next track on here really pushes that soundscape vibe as well. There are some bustling synthesizer sequences that are introduced eventually, and the song really gains direction. But even in these moments, I don't really feel like I'm listening to a song as much as I am a painting of a landscape or just something really cinematic. And all in all, that is the Tangerine Dream record, Phaedra. Interesting little progressive electronic album, while in my opinion not one of the most epic in the genre and not one of the most epic in Tangerine Dream's entire discography. It's certainly one of the easiest to get into. It's concise, it's well put together. I think it exemplifies a lot of the key characteristics of this genre and executes them really, really well. And I think it's an album you should check out. Transition. If you've given this LP a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Tangerine Dream, Phaedra, forever.